This was one of the most challenging cases I've ever been involved in. A serial sexual predator was terrorizing women all over Orlando and over a period of years. The MO was always the same, and the perpetrator was always very careful not to leave much physical evidence behind. And then we thought we had him, but it wasn't going to be easy. It was like chasing a ghost.
The women of Orlando are under attack.
Breaking news. Another woman was assaulted early this morning. Orlando police now...
Tonight, police are patrolling the Orlando metropolitan area to prevent new attacks by a suspect.
Tonight at 5. Still no sign of the suspected serial rapist as police continue their search for a man.
As police try to stop a string of rapes in Orlando, Florida, a man enters the apartment of a young single woman in a quiet neighborhood. The intruder sexually assaults her in her bedroom. The ordeal drags on for hours. But the victim never gets a good look at her attacker. His face is covered and socks are pulled over his hands. Before disappearing into the night, he rummages through the victim's house and steals some jewelry. When police arrive at the scene, they're convinced this is the work of the serial rapist they have been hunting for months. Chief Ken Cox of the Orange County Sheriff's Department has seen the same MO many times before.
The perpetrator would make entry usually while the victim was sleeping and apparently would survey the apartment first. His entry was usually consistent with either unlocked doors, unlocked windows, or at least easy access to these apartments.
Weeks later, there's another attack, and it follows the same pattern. Again, the intruder covers his face. Again, he assaults his victim for hours and steals some jewelry before slipping out the window. And again, he leaves little evidence behind. For the Orlando Police Department, the case of the ghostly attacker remains a mystery. Lieutenant John O'Grady is another investigator on the case.
He was taking off his shoes going into the house and then putting them back on when he left, so there'd be no shoe prints. And putting socks on his hands, we'd find socks from the victim's drawer out in the yard, so obviously he was putting them on when he went in there.
But in a few of the cases, saliva and seminal fluid was recovered from the crime scene. And detectives hope this evidence will provide a vital clue. But lab results take time. And while they wait for test results, the detectives compare notes. Their case files show eerie similarities.
We've got absolutely no fingerprints in any of these cases. Apparently, as our victims are indicating, as well as you said your victims are, he's covering his hands.
We have minimal prints at all, if any, to go by.
What type of items are you finding he's taken from the scenes? We're getting jewelry taken from the victims and little trinkets from around the room,
yes.
Possibly souvenirs for him.
Yes, on these two cases, he did just that. He took trinkets, had them remove the jewelry from their body, went to the jewelry box, removed a couple of items, bracelets, rings, earrings, and took those.
The hunt for the serial rapist whose face is never seen continues without much luck. So a major task force is formed.
When I got the call on this case, I was asked to look at a series of sexual assaults. The profilers come to the table with a different set of experience than the rest of the investigators do. As part of the profilers' training, we're exposed to literally hundreds of cases from all over the world, and we may have had experience with a very similar case in the past, and we can share this information.
When criminal profiler Dale Hinman reviews the case file of the Orlando attacker, she also notices the pattern of behavior. He covers his hands. He spends hours with his victims. But most significantly for Hinman, the attacker always steals jewelry from the crime scene.
Profilers look at what's taken from the rape victim to measure whether or not this is a souvenir of the crime. But when a person is taking things that they can spend, or they can exchange for drugs, or they can pawn, this moves out of the category of a souvenir or trophy and into somebody who's really a burglar, and they're taking things that they can use later on to exchange or buy drugs with or to get money from. So we knew we were looking for an experienced burglar.
A serial rapist has attacked at least 9 women in Orlando, Florida. He wears a mask, so no one has seen his face. He wears socks on his hands, so he never leaves fingerprints. And there's no sign that he's slowing down. Special Agent Hinman's initial profile suggests they are dealing with a sex offender who is also an experienced burglar, a dicey combination.
This is an offender who's taking things from the victims, things that he could possibly pawn or exchange for drugs, but he's also sexually assaulting the victim, which makes him very dangerous.
In order to do that, Hinman needs more information. So she heads to Orange County Sheriff's headquarters to meet with investigators.
One thing we're finding, Dale, is that the suspect is spending significant time with the victims, and prior to leaving each time, he's usually ties or secures them to their beds with their own clothing. Do you see a significance with that?
I think that the ability to remain and moving around in someone else's apartment before they wake up and staying with them after the assault begins probably means that he has an extensive burglary history and that he's very experienced being in someone else's home. Also, the fact that he's not supposed to be somewhere else is significant, that if, a male just got up and left his family in the middle of the night and then came back several hours later, the family members or the job would become suspicious.
And we are finding that to be true with the statements from our victims. They are indicating.
Hinman's profile slowly comes into focus. The attacker is probably single and most likely unemployed. Someone with experience in burglaries and sexual assaults. Someone who's probably had run-ins with the law. And that means DNA from the crime scenes might match up to an offender in the Florida Criminal Records database.
Do you have the lab results back from any of the cases yet regarding DNA?
Actually, one of our cases is back and it's inconclusive. And I know on 2 of his cases,
they've come back inconclusive as well, which brings us to a concern because usually we would get some sort of result back from these type of tests by now.
Inconclusive means lab technicians cannot detect any DNA in the semen samples. Senior crime lab analyst Nancy Rathman explains.
The unique characteristic of this particular individual is that all of these semen stains had no sperm cells in it, meaning or what I would refer to as aspermatic samples.
No sperm cells means no DNA. But saliva samples were also collected from the crime scenes, and they should yield some DNA. They should, but they don't.
Even though he was leaving his saliva behind, he had the problem with the female also being present in that mixture. So there was a chance that the female would still hide or mask some of the male's DNA type.
In short, there's no way to distinguish the perpetrator's DNA from the victim's. But that's not the end of the bad news. Lab technicians can't even determine the blood type of the attacker, a relatively easy thing to do.
Approximately 20% of the population are referred to as non-secretors, meaning that if I tested their blood, their semen or their saliva or their sweat or their vaginal fluid, I would be unable to determine what ABO blood type they were.
An aspermatic non-secretor, a combination rare enough that only a handful of all males would qualify. And when Hinman reads the results, she realizes what the task force is up against.
Well, an individual who is a non-secretor would represent a very small group of our population anyway, and then to be aspermatic on top of that, it was like chasing a ghost.
Then, a break. In a seemingly unrelated incident, an Orlando man is awakened by the sounds of an intruder breaking into his young daughter's bedroom.
The suspect ran from the apartment with the father in pursuit, and the father was able to tackle him here in the yard. A scuffle ensued here in the yard, at which time the suspect again was able to elude the father and run towards the street. When the suspect got into the street, there was a civilian vehicle coming across the road and actually struck the victim.
The intruder survives the crash and is taken into police custody. His name is Ronnie Ray Brown, a 37-year-old with a lengthy rap sheet that includes a sexual assault conviction. And when Hinman finishes reviewing his file, she's sure that the search for the serial rapist is over.
Essentially, everything he had done in his life had led up to this point. He had prior burglary arrests and convictions. He had prior sexual assault arrests and convictions. Everything about him was what we expected as our serial rapist. We all felt that this was it. The case was over and that there would be an easy conviction in this serial rape case.
Coming up next, the suspect has been caught. Or has he? A sexual predator has been terrorizing women in Orlando, Florida for months. A suspect, Ronnie Ray Brown, is hit by a car while fleeing the scene of a burglary. Criminal profiler Dale Hinman notices that Brown has been previously convicted of crimes that bear an eerie resemblance to the cases she and a task force are trying to solve.
Because the crime circumstance in the case from that day matched the others, it was in the same area, that he matched the physical description that was given by the previous victims. Even though they didn't see his face, they knew basically his height and weight. Everything about these cases matched, so we knew we had the right person.
While Ronnie Ray Brown sits in jail on the attempted burglary charges, detectives request a sample of his DNA to compare it to the unsolved rapes. But they know that this won't help them much, since the samples from the sexual assault crime scenes came back inconclusive. There is nothing to compare Ronnie Ray Brown's DNA to. But Brown's lab results do show something. He is a non-secretor, just like the serial rapist. This evidence confirms their suspicions that Brown is their man. But it's meaningless in a court of law.
The fact that we identified him as being a non-secretor was not enough evidence to convict him for these other crimes, because obviously there are other non-secretors in the area. We certainly have not positively identified him or connected him to these other cases.
Since investigators can't conclusively link Ronnie Ray Brown to any of the rapes, he is charged with a lesser offense. His sentence is the maximum allowable, 10 years in prison.
None of us had any doubt in our minds that Ronnie Ray Brown was, in fact, the serial rapist responsible for these crimes, because once he was sent to prison, we didn't have any similar crimes after that.
2 years pass, and then something happens that investigators thought impossible. On Valentine's Day, a woman is attacked in her home. The perpetrator wears a mask over his face and socks over his hands. He assaults his victim for hours. Before he flees, he steals the victim's jewelry. The only thing investigators recover is a saliva sample. Otherwise, no hair, no fingerprints, no footprints, nothing. Within weeks, another attack takes place, and the details are exactly the same.
We were meeting one morning for breakfast, and we were going over our cases. Certainly, we presented the facts in our case, and the city presented the facts in their case. And I'm sitting at this breakfast and I'm listening and I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness, that is so consistent to Ronnie Ray Brown.
When Hinman hears the news, she has the same reaction.
I was sitting at my desk one afternoon and I got a call from the Orlando Police Department, and the opening line was, "What would you say if we had a new series of sexual assaults where this particular criteria occurred?" And they named a few of the characteristics of 3 crimes that had taken place. And my immediate response was, I would say, where is Ronnie Ray Brown?
The last time anybody had heard of Ronnie Ray Brown was 2 years earlier, when he was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
We thought, oh my goodness, maybe we were wrong, and was he actually our serial rapist?
Coming up, investigators reopen the case of the Orlando serial rapes. After a 2-year hiatus, a sexual predator has struck again in Orlando. But the main suspect, Ronnie Ray Brown, is behind bars.
When the attack started up again in the same area with the exact same MO and even the same words being used, all of us were certain it was Ronnie Ray Brown all over again.
And Hinman is right. When investigators call the prison where Ronnie Ray Brown is supposed to be serving out a 10-year sentence, they're told he's recently been released.
It's just the way our system's unfortunately set up now that people go away get a 7 to 10 year sentence, they're out in 2.5 years. Especially when they're put away for a nonviolent crime such as burglary or drugs, which doesn't tell the full story.
Thank you.
Investigators are certain that Ronnie Ray Brown is back in business and responsible for the latest assaults. They put him under 24-hour surveillance and hope that he'll slip up. He does. On the second night he's being watched, Ronnie Ray Brown makes an illegal turn and gets arrested for driving with an invalid license. It's enough to put him back behind bars and gives investigators time to build a case against him for the latest sexual assaults.
All of the original people who investigated the first series of sexual assaults came to the table again to try and figure out what else we could do to make a conviction against him stick, this time considering the lack of evidence.
Once again, Hinman goes back to her case files and reviews the latest string of attacks. And suddenly, the light bulb goes off.
I think it was kind of a brainstorm among all of us at the exact same moment that if we stopped working him as a rapist and started working Ronnie Ray Brown as an armed burglar, that if he was taking things from the scene and we could recover these, then certainly the punishment for armed burglary is almost as severe as that for sexual battery.
Armed with a search warrant, investigators show up at Ronnie Ray Brown's home.
Orange County, Florida, state of Florida, OPD case number 9771759.
They videotape every inch of the house and every item inside his bedroom.
After the entire scene was videoed and then the video was brought back to the Orlando Police Department, each of the victims was called and invited to come and view separately the video to see if they could identify anything that came from Ronnie Brown's bedroom at this home. And it was a very emotional experience for these young women to come to the police department and look at this video and be able to point to things that were on the video that belonged to them. There's watches and pieces of jewelry, rings and necklace. They knew that these were their items and they were seeing them in this man's bedroom. We knew we had him.
Hinman's strategy paid off. Ronnie Ray Brown can now be placed at the scene of the sexual assaults. But it's not the same as proving he committed them. Again, investigators can only charge Ronnie Ray Brown with burglary, which carries a lesser penalty. But this time, technology is on their side, and DNA testing has advanced significantly since the attack started years before.
I remember one day I was sitting at my desk and I got a call from the lab, and they said, "You're not going to believe it. We finally have a positive match on Ronnie Ray Brown." for his DNA. So I was one of 3 individuals that actually were blessed with going over to the jail and to finally charge him with a sexual battery. And I said, well, Ronnie, I got good news and bad news for you. And I said, well, I'll tell you the good news first. And I remember he leaned in towards me and I went, the state's dropping the burglary charge on you. And he kind of looked back like, I beat another one. And I said, and the bad news is technology finally caught up with you. And I'm charging you today with 2 counts of rape.
Ronnie Ray Brown is tried and convicted on both counts. He is sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole.
We all had felt that for so many cases, Ronnie Ray Brown had beat us because of luck or because of his genetics or for some reason or another. But on this occasion, we all felt like that we had finally figured out a way to beat him.